Like I was living outside of Chicago in this little town called St. Charles, and this friend of ours like lived closer in and could get like college radio, and he's like, "Oh, there's this band. You got to hear them. They're the worst band in the world. They're just terrible. They're like, it's not even music, man. It's terrible." And so, as a joke, I was like, "Okay, I'm gonna find this band." And my best friend in high school, I got him the Flipper generic album, and I like, "Here's your birthday present," and put it on, and we're like, "Oh God, how would you even make a record like this? You know, this is just terrible." But the more we listened to it, the more we were like sort of transfixed by it, because it's actually an amazingly psychedelic record, and it kind of just like really made me think like all this crap that I was thought things had to be like didn't have to be, because they didn't have any rules, and they had all these songs about like you know, the lyric sheet is inspired by Wilhelm Reich and his like orgone theory and like all this crap that, you know, was like totally over our like 14-year-old heads. And then we saw in the paper that they were coming to play, and we went to the show, and we like dressed like kind of like new wave in our like little, what we thought were cool like suit coat type things. So we get there, and it's Naked Raygun and Flipper, and Naked Raygun were cool, but they look like guys that, you know, could be in high school, like could have gone to my high school, like they're kind of like jockey guys or whatever. And then Flipper comes out, and like we didn't even know that they were a band. We just thought that they were like, they looked like mechanics or something, like guys that work on cars, and they also looked to our eyes like they were about like in their late 40s or something. They're just they look terrible. You know, they're like all like decrepit, and like Bruce Luce, like, you know, had like, you know, a really bad dye job, and they all looked like they didn't get a lot of sleep, and like Will was like losing his hair and was like, you know, his hairline was about up to here, and for like a, I don't know, for, and their show didn't really start. It just sort of like drifted into beginning, and they just held the audience's attention by sheer like sort of charisma, you know? Like when I listened to the record, I always, and at the show, I would like try to figure out like what the Ted Falcone was actually playing or doing, like, 'cause he was just sort of like blindly hitting strings, and I would try really hard when I started playing like to duplicate that sound, and never, like, it was just sort of this miasma of noise, but it fit perfectly. It was just, I don't know, it was just like a revolutionary moment for me, just because it was like, oh, well, you can do this on sheer like sort of force of will and personality alone. It doesn't really take anything else beyond that. It's just like, it's just, you know, making your presence felt and sort of insisting on it, you know, I don't know. And when the conversation stops, you open. It's my birthday.
When I was 15 or 16, extremely hormonally challenged, you know, coming out as a lesbian at my high school, really rural little high school I went to. So, I don't know, I got Sinead O'Connor CD. I just remember taking, it was actually tape, I bought a tape, and I listened to it. I don't even know how many times when I got it right in a row, and I just laid on my bed and listened to it, and it just, I mean, it just immediately, I was just taken by it, and it was, I don't know, maybe my first experience with somebody singing so kind of raw, so emotive, probably at that age. I mean, I was into some alternative music already, like I had started to get into, you know, weird music, especially in my high school. I was definitely the freak. She seemed really tough, you know? She seemed really cool. She had a shaved head, and she, I don't know, she ripped up that picture of the Pope on Saturday Night Live, is that right? On Saturday Night Live? I mean, and I don't know, she just seemed like she was totally taking chances and being somebody different in that world for women especially, you know, like that she made it into the mainstream. And but there's something about her that was just like I said, just like so emotional and passionate. Like the way she sang just felt like, I don't know. It just really affected me.
You ready? In the 8th grade,
When I was 13, a friend of mine gave me a tape, and on the first side it was various songs by the Dead Kennedys, and on the second side of the tape it was various songs by PIL. And I think getting that tape was a big changing point in my life, because up until then, the only music I'd ever heard was on the radio, and that was commercial pop music.
I too had a similar experience to Nicola.
In the 8th grade, I had a friend who gave me a cassette. It was from his older brother. They had once lived in Atlanta, and I grew up in the middle of nowhere in Indiana, and so it was hard to obtain anything that wasn't mainstream.
So when I heard the music on that tape, it was like I'd never heard anything like that. So from that point on, every time I go into a record store, I try and find something that wasn't mainstream, that looked a little
weird.
So who's going first?
I will. Is Adam in the picture?
This friend of mine would always take these cassettes from his older brother, and we would listen to them, and there were no playlists or anything, and we didn't know who was on them.
I love music. Go with those early takes.
I know. Do you want to?
Yes.
like, I remember I bought a Cramps record, Bad Music for Bad People, a Ramones record, their first one, The Clash, all these things that didn't seem like it was mainstream music.
This is the real deal.
First of all, we loved the music and it spoke to us, and so it became this mission in like the 8th grade to find out who was on these tapes. And as it turned out, it was bands anywhere from Depeche Mode to the Human League to the Dead Kennedys to Black Flag.
How do I look?
It's funny because all these records that I had when I was 13 are still some of my favorite records today and make a big impact on how I am as a musician.
I think this really started my whole musical career, if you can call it that. It started there, and it hasn't left, this desire to find, collect, trade music. And I think that's important for me as a musician when I'm writing a song, or when we're making an album. I want to be part of that lineage, that history of non-mainstream music.
That's all right.
Viva la revolution!
And I think that's pretty much it.
I can pinpoint to a moment exactly when my interest in music started. I was on a bus on a school field trip, and I was maybe 14 years old, 15 years old. One of the guys on the bus had one of those little school cassette players that they use in language lab, you know, like a little, sort of like that big with the 4 buttons on the end, you know. And he had a Ramones cassette that his brother had gotten at college, or like his brother had gotten the Ramones album and made a cassette for him, and he was playing this first Ramones album. I thought it was just the funniest thing ever. So we were on this really long field trip, and we just kept playing this Ramones cassette over and over again, and I thought it was the funniest thing I'd ever heard. I couldn't believe anybody would make music like that. And like, I recognized that they were trying to make this sort of bubblegum pop music, but it sounded so blown up and so like inept that it was really charming. So I wrote down the name of the band in my notebook, and like when we got back to town, within a day I had gone to the record store in town and asked if they could order that album for me. And I don't know if they still have these, but they used to in like sort of small town record shops, they used to have these things called the Schwann Record Guide, which is this giant sort of library dictionary size reference book of all the records in print. And so this sort of matronly lady at the record store flipped through the Schwann Record Guide and found the Ramones album and ordered it for me. And I was like on pins and needles for the couple of weeks it took for that album to make its way to Missoula, Montana. And I kept calling him and asking him if he'd come in. I'm sure I made a real nuisance of myself. And then they called me and said the record came in, and I raced down there and I bought that album. I played that record, like, play it, flip it over, play the other side, flip it over, play it again, flip it over, play it over again.
I listened to that record sort of continuously for about, I don't know, about 2 weeks. And in the time between when I first heard it and when it finally arrived, my recollection of this hilarious record that I'd heard just kept growing. And I was imagining that, you know, when I play this record, that it was just going to be this like buffoonish, clowny thing. Over the sort of methodical listening and re-listening to this first Ramones album again and again and again, at some point it stopped being funny. Like, I was playing it for all my friends, like, you got to hear this record, it's the stupidest thing ever. And at some point, like, it stopped being just a novelty and became the best music in the world, the best thing I'd ever heard. And in this small circle of friends of mine, we all sort of started becoming really obsessive Ramones fans. And then I found out they had another record available, and so I instantly ordered that record. Then I found out there was another record, and I ordered that one. Every single thing that I've done in music or in, you know, this sort of profession that has overwhelmed the rest of my life, I can trace to that one moment of hearing the Ramones cassette on a school bus. There are times when I think, you know, I was really lucky that on that field trip, when I was in that susceptible mode, that, you know, I didn't end up hearing like a Rush record or a Grateful Dead record or something. I mean, who knows how my life would have gone if I had, you know.
I do remember being in high school and driving when I first got my license when I was 16 and hearing the song Are You Experienced by Jimi Hendrix on XRT. I was only 20 years old at the time already, but I had to go get it, and I took it around and played it for every friend I had, and everybody thought I was nuts, and that's when I knew I was basically alone in the world. And it wasn't very long after that I started listening to Miles Davis, and that really kind of changed everything. I would say that was it. If any record changed what I thought I might want to do with music, it was Bitches Brew. And my dad was a DJ on WXFM, and he had 20,000 records, but there were a handful of them he never played. He liked to play pretty much straightforward jazz music, not a lot of stuff that had electronic elements, so I raided his Miles Davis collection, and I took Bitches Brew and Agartha, and he might have even had Big Fun, I can't remember. I just took it off his shelves from the studio because he never played it. In fact, I asked him if he would play it, and he told me never, as long as he was living, would any of that music make it on his radio show. And it's not based on a group of people trying to follow a song structure. It was everybody kind of creating the music together at one time. And since I don't write songs and stuff like that, I thought the best way that I could be involved in actually creating the music or whatever is if it was extemporaneous, you know, at the time of its creation. And so that's how I figured as a drummer I'd have my best involvement in actually designing the music. And I listened to that record all the time, but I listened to it a lot when I was doing my schoolwork and stuff like that. It got to the point where I didn't even bother trying to call people up to find out if we were going to go play baseball or anything. I just go to my room, put the stereo on, and either just lay there listening to stuff or doing my schoolwork or whatever. But I spent a lot of time alone and mostly listening to music and seeing a lot of shows. I saw a lot of shows, but I don't think many of them had the impact for me that records did.
Well, where I can really start my obsession with music and everything back to is probably my 4th grade birthday party, because right around that time I'd figured out that there were these things called records, and you know, because, well, I mean, I had records, but that bands have catalogs, and so, you know, you can get all these records by this one person.
That was you.
I assigned to each of my friends a different album by ELO, who were my favorite band, except to one guy who got me one of those gerbil cages. which that was sad because then the little baby gerbils died in the little thing. It was right around the time that their double album, Out of the Blue, came out, and that was just like my favorite record. That one I went down and bought myself, and you know, it was like walking like 2 miles to the record store and, you know, buying the record.
That was good.
To go from like only interacting with music through the radio and through, like, you know, I had this weird little transistor radio and this cool little tape recorder that my dad had brought back from Vietnam that was a reel-to-reel, but a really small one. And I used to try so hard to record whole songs off the radio, which meant you had to be like ready to start right there. And I only knew how to record it by holding this little condenser mic up to this little radio. To go from that to records, and then not just to records, but to, like, you know, realizing, oh, this person they made all these records, and they go back years. To have all those was so cool. And then this is the time of, you know, double albums, which of course, you know, for most people at the time, you know, they'd seed their pot with it. For me, it was just like, you know, staring at these things, and, you know, the cover of Out of the Blue, you know, is like this crazy outer space spaceship thing that the docking bay is just like an 8-track, and my older sister had an 8-track, so, you know, I knew that's what it was. The whole idea of sitting on your bed with the record playing and, like, watching the record spin, like you're seeing something happen, and then and then, like, reading the lyrics, you know, and it's like, I wish I was, whoa-ho-ho-ho, a Wild West hero, you know? But, like, because of the way they're sung and because of the emotion of the singer, like, it has deep meaning, and it still does to me now, you know? I listen to that song and, like, I want to cry, and it's the dumbest song, and I love it so much. That whole experience of having, like, in front of me all these records, and they seem to be like a whole world in and of themselves. That was really, for, like, the most important, like, single musical thing for me. There you go.
I mean, I think the band that probably had the greatest impact on me early on, and still, like, I think set me, my kind of aesthetic in motion, was the Minutemen. They just kind of went against the grain, and you know, they were this punk rock band, but they didn't do it in any way like anyone else did. It was totally their own thing. They were able to bring in all these different ideas, whether musical or political, and never be heavy-handed with them. Always have their own personality. I think it kind of, like, set me free. The way I looked at stuff, whether it was music or politics or whatever, it just kind of made me look at things outside of the conventional framework of, like, punk rock or whatever. I liked them just about more than anyone at the time, and especially seeing them live. There was, like, seeing them perform, you know, against a lot of hardcore bands. They just seemed a lot more fun and seemed to be into it a lot more, and they stylistically were covered way more ground. They had ambitions that were, like, kind of anathema to punk rock, you know. I mean, you know, a lot of bands kind of dabbled in different genres, but they just didn't care. I mean, they were so open with these kind of uncool influences, you know, and the way they would throw in, like, kind of improv stuff on their records, or, like, you know, all sorts of different styles. And I think that just kind of, I mean, I think I had it in me to be interested in all that stuff, but I think it kind of, you know, at an impressionable age, still in high school, it kind of, like, made it okay to just jump all over the place. You know, I mean, I'm just interested in really, you know, writing. I'm interested particularly in hearing new stuff all the time, and I think, you know, it's just being open to all sorts of music, and I don't mean just all kinds of rock music. I mean everything there is produced in the world. And, you know, I think a band like the Minutemen really embraced kind of all these styles while remaining true to themselves, and just were so kind of comfortable doing that. It was a complete package for me, like, all the way. It just never did seem to do anything wrong, which maybe that was, you know, that was the one positive thing about D. Boone dying, is that they never had a chance to fuck up too bad.
graduated high school in 1976, and there was a record that had an incredible effect on me. I started reading too, books like Dante's Divine Comedy and Ulysses from Jim Joyce, and Huck Finn, Mark Twain. These had a huge effect on me too, but this record from this guy named Richard Hell and his band The Voidoids made quite an impression on me. It was called The Blank Generation. And I find out, you know, that this guy is a bass player, and he has a band, and he writes his songs. And I understand bass came to me really through D. Boone's ma. She thought we should have a band, you know, and well, basically, we lived in Park Western, was kind of like projects in Pedro, and it was a way to keep us in the house, like a Econo child care. And you know, you read on the back of the record, and every band had a bass, you know, so she goes, "You're gonna play bass." You know, arena rock and stuff. I didn't even know what bass was. I didn't even know they had bigger strings. I mean, it looked kind of like a guitar. So I played a guitar with just 4 strings. And I come to find out, I mean, this is the early 70s and stuff, that bass is kind of the right field of being in a band, you know, so a huge inferiority complex. So this record, Blank Generation, I remember putting it on, and it was so wild to what I had ever heard before. I mean, the guy's voice just jumped out of the speakers, and I don't know, I was very smitten and taken by it. And so he had a sleeve with all these pictures. He had, you know, him in a bathtub, a picture of Edgar Allan Poe. I had read every story by Edgar Allan Poe at that time. I was kind of an internalized guy. I've read a lot of fiction. D. Boone got me into reading history and all this, but I was in the pretend world a lot. But anyway, there was a picture on there of him just standing there. So I cut it out and I put it on my bass. And, you know, I taped it on there. And this was really a line in the sand. I mean, it's 1977. And when I started wearing it around and playing keggers in Pedro, and this was a line in the sand to a lot of folks. You know, they couldn't tolerate the idea of punk rock. A lot of people could not figure it was a way to try to write your own songs and play gigs and just find your own voice. You know, they thought it was whatever. In fact, I had people tell me, you know, I knew you'd be one of these, and you know, what are you trying to do? You know, are you trying to fuck with rock and roll? And you know, after a while, I was like, okay, yeah, I am gonna fuck with rock and roll. You know, me and D. Boone, we're gonna write our own songs and try to find our own sound. I mean, no more copying the Blue Oyster Cult records. This is a vehicle for us, and if you can't figure it out, if you're hung up on the clothes or whatever, the sounds, good. And it really helped me not be afraid, because I know it's not marketed this way, but rock and roll in those days was all about fitting in and conformity. And this Richard Hell record, and then records after it like Pop Group and Wire and stuff for me and D. Boone, and Georgie too later on, was really a confidence character builder for us, for not be afraid and try to find our way. And it was quite inspiring, almost much more than getting that poster at that first T-Rex show of Mark Bolan, you know, on my wall, my first rock star hero, and then John Fogerty with his Righteous shirts, that little Richard voice and stuff. And because I don't know, it gave us the nerve to not be afraid, and like a great man once said, let the freak flag fly. And I mean, I don't know what we were living up to anyway, because these rock and roll people, they didn't want us anyway, so I don't know why we were trying to live up to any of their ideas anyway. So the punk rockers really said it was okay to have a parallel universe, you know, and be a wheel within the wheel. And so I can't tell you how that inspired me. And then last summer, I did something with Lee Ronaldo where we played some Finnegan Wake things. And it was a block away from Richard Hell's apartment. He lived since '75, I think. And he came over and took me up there. And he brings out the bass he bought when him and Tom Verlaine ran away to New York City. And I got to play it. I couldn't believe it. And so with all these years, you know, this is my 49th tour. I still felt like that young Watt again, you know? Like, oh, yeah, all you have to do is find someone you really like and try to go hard with them. And that's all you need. You don't need any kind of permission, just some inspiration. And I still look for that. There's people, there's works in my life that still fire me up. I'm convinced I don't have this all figured out, and it's still a journey, and I'm still trying to find other parts of my voice. And I'm still the bass player. It wasn't just a stage for me. And so I feel very grateful for those weird collection of accidents and collisions that has helped shape where I'm sailing now.
Fourth grade, I wake up Saturday morning. My parents bought me a sweet drum set. The day began wonderfully. I strapped that mother on and started playing Love and Touch and Squeezing, you know what I'm saying? They pulled that out of nowhere and it was a huge surprise. Obviously influenced my human beatbox and such thing that I got going on. What was the topper though that day was that evening they split out of town like they often do on Saturday night to probably go to some, you know, interstate mahjong competition or something. And them splitting allowed me the opportunity to go see my first concert. And that concert was Kiss with Judas Priest opening up. Judas Priest scared the shit out of me, you know, leather, choppers, hats, a big motorcycle in the middle of the stage. Guy just kept revving it for about 5 minutes. You know, everyone was responding accordingly, being whooped up into a frenzy, and I was like, God, what a spectacle. We were all Kiss heads at that point. We were actually right behind the stage, so we just saw a bunch of, like, they could have been a bunch of old Mexican ladies for all we knew, you know, because all we saw was this big hair and such, and every once in a while a little tongue would jet out, you know. Pretty perverse. I wagged my fist and, you know, copped some moves I saw other people doing, you know, smelled some strange odors and stuff, and felt pretty righteous on the way home. Was probably the coolest cat in the 4th grade with my Kiss t-shirt the next day. You know, finally a palpable experience from which to sort of, you know, hike onward from, you know. I mean, it was just a point in time that I actually felt great about things, you know, about life and, you know, doing illegal stuff, you know, and getting away with it and being able to celebrate by, you know, beating on the drums, you know, warrior within kind of stuff.
But it was a secret thing from your parents, did you say?
Yeah, they never figured it out. I mean, you know, they came back with their winnings and I woke up with mine. We all probably had the best breakfast in our lives that following Sunday.
Well, when I was really little, I did the transistor under the cover thing. It wasn't to hide from my folks, because they've always been real supportive of what I've been doing in music and everything, but I'd hide the transistor under the covers and just more because I wanted to make this personal space to listen to music in, a little tent world. I was like listening to the Monkees and the Raiders then, and I was like really super into all that music. And I was kind of never crushed on those guys as much as I kind of want to do what they were doing and stuff. So when I was about 10, my brother got married, and he had his wedding in Louisville, and he was in Pi Kappa Alpha, so he had his frat brothers come up to be in his wedding. And among his frat brothers were these two boys that had a band, and the band was called the Moxies. And they stayed at our house, and there was this kind of like weekend where all the guys were staying there and they're having parties and stuff. So I was like hanging out and talking to these fellas, pretty fascinated. Like I was about 10 then. And the one fella, George Coriel, was the leader of the band. At the end of the weekend, George gave me like this single that his band had made. And the band was the Moxies, and you see on it, it says, distributed by Mox Records, Box 871, Paducah, Kentucky, and produced by the Moxies. And, you know, it's like this just really cool thing. It was so awesome to me to connect this record with the person that was staying with me and hanging out and just being like a normal person, and never really like thought about it being that close of a thing, like maybe that's something that I could do. He also gave me this picture, which I've carried ever since I had a band. That's George, that's Barney. Sometimes when a little bit of the allure might get rubbed off because of like, you know, dealing with like 8 annoying clubs in a row or something, like take that on my wallet and go, oh yeah, that's like the fun part, you know? I've just carried these things around forever because it was like really the first time I could make that connection, you know, between like something I hear on the radio and I'm fascinated with, and then this like person's in my life, and then he put out his own record, you know? And so I was kind of primed to do that when, like, you know, stars all came together and I met people and everybody else was doing it, and became an easy thing to do. You know, actually in 60 circles, I guess people do know about them. They're like on these playlists and stuff from a bunch of stations doing 60 shows, so that's just funny. I don't know whether anything's your own private thing anymore. At least for 45 years it was. Well, 35.
I'm really inspired by Bertoia sculptures, sound sculptures. They're quite interesting because of the fact that they don't sound like anything musical. They're just meant to sound like sound. The epitome of what would be unnatural sound by unnatural elements like steel and bronze. They improvise. They improvise because gravity is helping them to improvise and to move in a very random form. It's almost like free jazz, but with steel pieces, like industrial jazz. When I did performances of them at Cranbrook last year, it really gave me a different concept of how to make music and how to do things that are out of the ordinary, especially by me focusing on synthesized music for so long, you know, the majority of my career, and then to use something that sounds synthetic but isn't made with electronics at all. It just gave me a totally new way of looking at music. Architecture penetrates into my psyche in a very similar way as what the Bertoia sculptures have over time. Seeing architecture from Mies van der Rohe here in Detroit, as well as in Toronto and New York. Gaudi architecture in Barcelona. Two quite different styles, very different styles. I like the simplicity and the minimalism of Mies van der Rohe and the Bauhaus. How that really inspires me is because a lot of my music has been complex, a lot of notes, a lot of sounds, and by seeing clean work like his, it gives me a new idea of how to take my music and scale it down and concentrate on focusing it to an idea instead of many ideas. Gaudi has been inspirational because his architecture is probably more like the work that I've done in the past, or it's just insane. I mean, you wouldn't think that architecture would be integrating shapes from the human body, bones and skulls and things of that sort into a living space, into a business space. But, you know, he did it, and he was way ahead of his time by doing it. No one else has been able to touch it. And I really like that, because I've always thought of electronic music, especially techno, being ahead of its time. The complexity of it, you know, is very similar, as I said earlier.
When I graduated high school, my family, we moved back from Argentina to the U.S. And that's when I met Phil and Nate, you know, about a week or two after I moved to the U.S. And my idea of punk rock was, you know, late 70s British stuff and Argentine punk bands. I had no idea about anything, no hardcore from the U.S., nothing like that. So they took me to go see Fugazi at the old Citadel Center in D.C. with a band called Geek and this go-go band. And that show really blew me away, because it was the first time I saw a punk band that had really good songs, that could really play their instruments, and it was super exciting and energetic and new and different. And at least for me, this is like end of '89 or something. That for me was really new at the time. And especially Brendan Canny's drumming, that really impressed me, because I was, you know, 17 years old, and that was like, you know, really opened my eyes, that show, that you could play music like that had the energy of the punk stuff I'd listened to before, but was so much more sophisticated in a way. I really liked that, and that was a really great show.
Should start by showing the building there.
Ready?
Yeah. Am I introducing myself, by the way? I'm Ian. That's my high school, Wilson High School here in Washington, D.C. It's a public school. I graduated in 1980, and I spent a couple of years in this school arguing with my friends about sort of the relative rock-worthiness of certain bands. I was definitively in the Ted Nugent camp. This is 1978, and they were telling me about the Ramones. I thought Nugent definitely would have rocked harder than the Ramones, but the fact of the matter was, I had never listened to the Ramones. So they lent me a bunch of records: the Ramones, the Damned, the Sex Pistols, the Clash, Generation X. And I took them home, and this music scared the shit out of me. At first, it didn't make any sense to me at all as music. But eventually, I started to hear it, I started to understand it. And the fact that it scared me, it was intriguing. It made me want to hear more and try to get some idea of what was this all about. Eventually, kids here told me about this benefit for a radio station down in Georgetown that had been shut down. There was going to be a big protest, and that night there would be a benefit show for the radio station to try to save it, and there was a band called the Cramps. This is in January or February of 1979. Up to that point, I'd only seen really arena gigs, I'd only seen like rock gigs. It was cool. Ted Nugent was good live. He was hard. But when I went to go see the Cramps that night, what I saw in that room completely changed the way I ever thought about music. Because they were so close, there was no barrier. The room was packed with people, every walk of life, every different kind of crazy person was in that room. And the Cramps were so visceral. And I don't think they'd gotten half a set done before Lux just threw up all over everything. Supposedly he'd eaten a pizza and like had a case of beer or something. The kind of reaction the crowd had was just, it was mind-blowing. I mean, I was, of course, terrified. I was completely freaked out by it. But when I left there, I felt like something had occurred. And at that point, I thought, this is where I want to be. That's when I knew the Ramones rocked harder than Ted Nugent. That's when I realized that all this music that people have been talking about actually had some kind of quality or texture that was worth pursuing. A few months later, I went to go see the Damned play. And opening for them was the Bad Brains, who are from here in Washington. And that was the first time that I realized that right here in our own city, you could have a band that, of course, in my opinion, and I think many other people's opinion, was the greatest band in the world in 1980. There was no other band better than them. Their sort of accentuation on just doing things and just going for it and completely being free and just rocking so hard, it was so inspiring to all the kids here that we learned right away to never take no for an answer and just to build and to keep going. And now it's 22 years later.
I still remember this time, like, first getting into music, listening to, like, Pink Floyd and shit with my cousins, you know, like bad classic rock kind of shit. And I remember the first time his, like, friend, he was older than me, his friend gave him this record. He's like, man, you gotta check this shit out, it's fucking out of control. I was like, what? It's like, it's a band from Cleveland, they're the Dead Boys. I was like, the Dead Boys? What the hell kind of shit is that? And then you hear it and it's like, oh, you know, we were living in a small town in Ohio or whatever, and you hear it and you're like, ain't nothing to do. All right, I like this band already. Like, they were like, you know, some teen sentiments there or whatever. Our other friends going like, you guys are fucking crack, this stuff sucks. You guys can't even play. And I'm like, yeah, man, that's fucking awesome, isn't it? I learned how to play Sonic Reducer in like an afternoon or in a few minutes or something. I was like, damn, that's super easy. And then, you know, you start to think like, well, fuck, if these guys could have a band, I could have a band too, you know. All I gotta do is get it together and practice, right? That's all there was to it. My dearly departed cousin who died recently, I remember sitting in the tour bus and learning he died and thinking like, wow, man, I would never be on this thing if it weren't for that guy bringing home the Dead Boys record. How weird is that? That it went that far. I took it that far and didn't quit. I found out about it like on tour, you know, sitting on a tour bus, and he tells me, he was like, wow, I guess I'm really kind of like sitting on this tour bus because